Well, I think that we need to take it one step at a time and realize that no matter where you are, where you live, you can grow a pot of something. Even if it's you live in an apartment, you can use some pots on your balcony, or you can use a couple of pots in your kitchen sink, in your kitchen window. There's always a way.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Karina Belizzi.
Hello and welcome to another interview episode of Care More, Be Better. I'm your host, Karina Belizzi. Over the course of the past decade, you've likely heard about trends like foraging, creating urban gardens, and herbal apothecaries. We've even covered topics like that on this podcast as we explored guerrilla gardening and interviewed the founder of fallingfruit.org. This would engage you in foraging in your local environment. But do you really understand how and why the many plants in our wild and our cultivated spaces can support your health and wellness? Would you know how to identify these plants in the wild? How might you build your own backyard or apothecary garden? And with rising healthcare costs that affect all of us, do you know how to use herbs that you grow or wild forage yourself to achieve better health without breaking the bank? To help us answer these questions, I'm joined by master herbalist and author of Be Your Own Shaman, Jane Barlow Christensen. She is the owner of Barlow Herbal Specialties, a company that focuses on offering herbal solutions to help your body achieve optimal wellness. Jane's passion, knowledge, and expertise come from both her personal experiences and her family legacy in the world of herbal medicine. She believes that each of us is responsible for ourselves and the love, joy, spiritual, and physical health that we experience. With that, Jane Barlow, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. Happy to be here. We just met yesterday, so I'm excited to see you holding my book in your hands. And yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Now, as we get started in our conversation today, I'd really love for you to tell your personal family story, as you were brought up in a somewhat non-traditional perspective as the second oldest of 14 children.
Yeah, that alone sets me apart from the majority of human beings, right? So I grew up in the 60s and 70s, so it was a while ago, where maybe bigger families were a little more common, but I also grew up in a very religious family where big families were encouraged. But what really made, I think, my childhood unique is that my dad was a medicinal botanist, and his PhD was learning and studying and writing about why plant medicine is so important. He used to just like geek out on, what made a plant have the medicinal properties that it does and how do you identify it. We'd be driving somewhere as a family and he would see a plant that he wanted to identify. He would pull over, we'd all pile out, and there'd be this little group of kids and my dad, and he'd be like, now this plant, you use the leaves and the stems, sometimes the flowers, you collect it this time of day, you make it in, we can take it home and make it into a poultice or a salve, or so this was like super normal for me and my siblings. But then what happened as we got older, especially as teenagers, we were like totally embarrassed. We like shunned everything that was like, don't bring people home because there's pots of stuff growing and things curing in jars. But then I think what happened as adults for most of us is that we just started realizing what a gift it was to grow up with this kind of knowledge as just being part of our childhood. So it was very non-traditional. We didn't spend a lot of time in the doctor's offices. Of course, we went for, one of my sisters had her appendix out, and if there was a broken arm, but for the most part, we didn't go to the doctor. So it was very untraditional, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, as a child who grew up on a hippie commune and didn't even go to the hospital when my horse drugged me through barbed wire fencing, cutting my leg open, I get the feels, You just, it's kind of farm life. You just, okay, well, that's not that bad. Just like put a little cream on it, put a Band-Aid on it, you'll be okay? But that was the 60s and 70s from a cultural perspective too. And it seems like now in today's world, you get a scratch, you go into the ER or you're going to the doc in a box. And this also impacts the rising costs of our healthcare across the nation. And I think one part of that is cultural, one part of that is access. But we also have now this mandate that we're all supposed to have health insurance. And even just a single person on the Affordable Care Act is spending close to $500 a month just for their health insurance. That number is something that's hard for families to reach when so many can't afford a $400 emergent expense. So I feel like getting back to a little bit more of that perspective where we manage our own health is going to help us better as we go forward. Now, before we dive too much into health, I need to mention this podcast is for entertainment and education purposes only. We're not here to treat, diagnose, or cure. And if you have a specific ailment that you're working to treat, you should be in the care of a health professional in some capacity. So, what we're talking about today is more general. And we're really just trying to give you tools to help you on your journey. And for those that are curious about health and wellness, to be able to give them a tool like this book, to use it as a bit of a textbook, help you identify plants so you're looking at the right plants and then using them appropriately. So, getting back to this question of healthcare in America, how do you see herbs and natural products serving us better or potentially helping us to augment our personal health and manage our personal health care?
Well, I think that it's really, this should, herbal medicine should be called traditional medicine. And I really believe that our modern medicine should be called alternative. Because if you go in, I mean, that's kind of just been my thought process as a person who's been into natural medicine, not just since childhood, but now I've raised both my children and now I have grandchildren, and I've got a lot of experience underneath my belt. And it's still kind of, it doesn't necessarily rub me wrong, but I think it's so interesting that we call modern medicine traditional medicine. And so I really believe that there's a rise in the interest. How do I take an herb and get rid of a headache? Or how do I take a different tea and get rid of some nausea I might have? And I really believe that human beings are wanting to empower themselves with knowledge that is how human beings have been taking care of ourselves for thousands of years. So really, the modern medicine should be our alternative, because like you said, with your disclaimer, you can't, where we shine really is trauma care and with acute infections and acute situations. So I do think that we need to not throw out the baby with the bathwater. We need to say, okay, I live in this beautiful modern world with all of this medical technology that can make my life better and can save my life at certain times. In fact, 2 years ago, I had to have a full knee replacement because I had a bad water ski accident. So I'm not going to try to heal my knee with some herbs. So, I mean, of course, right? That just doesn't make any sense.
Well, they can
So,
accelerate your healing after the fact, and then you know how to use that, right? So,
yes,
so there's,
yes.
I think, this part that we don't always talk about where it's like they don't need to be completely separate. They can be used in conjunction to support your total health, and in fact, are typically more effective when you manage your health that way. I mean, many people are used to putting arnica on a sprain. Where does that come from but herbal medicine? So I think it's important to draw our attention to examples that people are going to be familiar with too along the way. But I've even heard, for instance, people using things like teas to help with headaches, like even just a simple peppermint tea to help with headaches or to help with digestive concern or just an upset tummy. So, what do you think are those kind of entry level herbs that people might already be familiar with that they could engage with as they're getting started and potentially on their journey to become their own shaman?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And this is one reason I included in the book a huge group of herbs that are more familiar, like people that are spices like rosemary, thyme, garlic, ginger, different herbs that people are familiar with, even basil. These are like really familiar, and people would be surprised at the medicinal benefits of some of these plants that are just so packed full of vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients. And not only do they flavor up our food, but they're so incredibly good for us. In fact, one of my favorites, which people might not realize, is feverfew. And feverfew is a beautiful perennial plant. It's in the daisy family, and it's actually one of the plants in my book. But it's got these beautiful white flowers with these little yellow buttons in the center. And it's not only beautiful in your flower garden, and it's a perennial, so it comes up every year, but you can take the leaves and you can steep up a tea. It'll go after a headache, but it's also good for digestion. It's got some anti-inflammatory properties. It's packed full of antioxidants. So not only are you taking something that tastes delicious, but it's so good for you. And to me, a really good place to start are with teas and with spices that you add to your food. So,
Now, as far as growing feverfew, that's something that grows well here in the United States. And as you mentioned, it does augment a garden. Now, I have to say, I come from a family that is also deeply steeped in botanicals because my father's a landscape architect. And one of the trends that he bucks is like this monocolor garden where people will say, "Oh, yeah, I want to only have two colors of flowers in my garden." And he's always leaned into what grows naturally locally, what is drought tolerant or flourishes in your local environment, and then leaned into those plants. So in my garden, I personally grow some basic herbs, like I grow rosemary, I grow oregano, I grow basil, and I also grow lemon balm because I like it in tea, lemon verbena. What else do I have? Oh, different sages, which I don't consume, but which I just love for their beauty. And so do my hummingbirds. I call them my hummingbirds. They fight over my garden, but you know,
I love that. I love that.
it's a multicolored garden. Like there's white flowers, there's blue flowers, there's pink and the hot lips of the white and pink combination sage, yellow. I mean, all the colors. It's like a rainbow garden and friendly to also the butterflies so that they have a corridor to come up and through their migratory path, given that I'm in California and the monarch comes through here. So I think it's important that we think about the plants that we grow and engage with. And to your point, also have some that we enjoy. Like my son, when he's sick, he goes into the garden and picks mint and he will make fresh tea with that. He likes to do that. He'll mix it with some local honey that we have too to soothe his throat. And it's something that I don't have to tell him to do. He's 9 years old and he wants to. He looks at it as a ritual and it's something that he enjoys. And I know that it's supporting his health at the same time. And so perhaps this is a little non traditional, but I got this book in the mail and my son picked it up and said he wanted to read it each day. And so I had shared this with you, but he wanted to read page by page. So we started off with the coverage of the first herb in your book, which is Iris versicolor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that one in particular is, I'm forgetting the common name, blue flag. I didn't know it
Blue
was actually
flag.
called that
Mm-hmm.
before now, right? And so he was reading about it going, "Mommy, can I go pick some iris and eat it?" And I'm like, "Oh no. Like we need to be careful now about my 9-year-old not just thinking he can go and eat every herb in this book. But this one in particular can be poisonous when ingested, but is used as a poultice to help you heal." So I found that really interesting that you included particular herbs, again, flowers that are very common in our area, but that could also be poisonous if not used correctly. Can you talk to me about the architecture of the book and why perhaps you included some of these particular plants?
Yes, 100%. That's a great question. So when I was in high school, I was a senior in high school, which was more than 45 years ago. My dad wrote a book on medicinal botany, and it contained 48 plants. It's called From the Shepherd's Purse. And when I updated his work, now he passed away 26 years ago. So he's been gone a long time. But the whole time that I've been running my herbal business and doing what I do, almost weekly for more than 2 decades, I have people ask me, "You need to republish your dad's book." And, we really, this needs to come back. Like you could go onto Amazon and it might cost you $200 or $500 because it's no longer in print. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I thought, you know what? I need to not only update my dad's book, I need to add the content and just add some more to it. So I took his original 48 plants, which included blue flag, because honestly, it's not something I use on a regular basis myself, but I wanted to honor my dad's legacy and I wanted to update the information from his original work. So one of the things that I know he did talk about was making a second volume on poisonous and edible plants. so that there would be more information about it. So I think there's always room for expansion and knowledge. And I really love that you're keeping a close eye on what your children are reading, because I think that this is important. You're right. You can't just see, oh, this is a pretty flower. And I mean, your son sounds very smart. And I think kids are smarter than we give them credit for. But that, to your point, that is a very good point. But that's the reason it's in the book. It's one of my dad's originals.
Well, and just using some things topically, they can't be ingested and being real about that and making it plain and clear. Each herb that you've covered in the book isn't like a chapter. It's not super long or deep. It's a couple of pages and gives you that kind of top line perspective on how it can be used. So I refer to it a little bit as like a primer textbook when I'm talking to my son about it. But if we wanted to learn a lot more about how iris could be used, we'd be digging into, much more research and how this was used traditionally. And maybe, I don't know if it would ever be used in a tea, but probably not, just as one
Probably
example.
not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
All right. So that I think is really wonderful. Now, I also wanted to connect to something else just with the title of the book because the term shaman has been coming up more and more in recent culture, especially with the use of medicinal mushrooms and ayahuasca ceremonies that seem to be all the rage lately. Why did you choose to position your book with this particular title?
Well, it is part of it was because it really is, it does seem to be a bit of a trend as far as using the word. But one of the first titles that I was thinking of was Be Your Own Healer or Be Your Own Doctor. And there is a chapter in the book on sacred plants and psychedelics. And it's chapter 14, and there's 7 plants but I don't have any preparation methods or dosing on any of those plants because to me, there's a whole different category when it comes to plant medicine on that level. I think there needs to be a lot of expertise. There needs to be care. There needs to be intention. I believe a lot of them take facilitation. But I really believe that at a base level of picking that title, we need to learn how to be our own healer. And a shaman is traditionally in a lot of Native American cultures. I have 3 adopted Native American siblings that I grew up with. They were part of the Eastern Shoshone tribe. They were 2, 3, and 4 years old when they were adopted into our family, and I was 4. So so there was a deep love of Native American plant medicine with my dad and his knowledge, and then my siblings. And to me, it just felt like, it was a good title and it could encompass what was happening in the world right now.
Yeah. Well, I personally have heard people saying, "Oh, I'm speaking to my shaman about this," and I'm like, "Okay, you have a medicine doctor that refers to themselves as a shaman," and it's new to me in a way, even though it's an old term, just because I hadn't heard it as much until like probably the last couple of years. And I feel like this could partially be seen as cultural appropriation. So I wondered if you had any perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think that cultures are meant to share with each other. Especially growing up with 3 siblings who are full-blooded Eastern Shoshone, they were part of I never looked at them as, you're a little brown person and I'm a little white person. To me, they were our siblings. They were fully adopted and embraced, and we did everything my parents did with us. There was no treated differently. So I think that cultures, this is what makes human beings that have different cultures and belief systems. This is what makes us unite as one, is when we can share our cultures. And I think that I've actually had a couple people be a little bit triggered by the title of my book. And I found it really interesting. I wasn't offended. I believe that we get offended too easily in today's world. I believe that cultures are to share. And I don't think they're meant to say, oh, well, I can't call my book a shaman because I'm a white girl. That just doesn't feel right in my soul. I feel like I can share cultures that maybe I didn't come from in this particular life. So yeah, that's a very good question. I've never had anybody ask me that.
Well, I just have to be sensitive to my audience. This show is about social impact and sustainability. And I also have a sibling who's half Native American. She doesn't always love it when I share things about Native American culture. And I think has felt like I'm appropriating the culture in some way to even talk about it, when my perspective has been that I am helping to raise awareness, and that I think it's important that we talk about the issues that affect us all, especially when you're talking about colonialism or, adoption methods that were very common in the past, where young Native people from around the world were adopted by families. And in today's world, there's just less of that. And in fact, adoption communities who try to speak out against adopting cross culture, which I have also thought was really interesting. My background is in cultural anthropology. I studied anthropology at UC Santa Cruz. I did archaeology digs around the globe from France to California. And so my background is kind of echoed on this throughout my life as an adult person. And today, spending over 20 years in the field of health and nutrition, specifically focused on herbs and then omega 3s, and then like total nutrition with vitamins, supplements, and, proteins and things along these lines. These are the sorts of things I've often thought about is, we borrow medicine from cultures around the world. We borrow food medicine from cultures around the world. We share knowledge. And, because I love a good curry, it shouldn't be seen as I'm appropriating this culture's food. It's part of the culture that I have developed with my family and my food culture. So, these are things that we need to think about and talk about, and also just respect the heritage, because there's so much amazing herbal medicine that comes from around the globe as well. And I think, you've mentioned in other podcasts that I've heard you on the importance of getting your herbs fresh. And of course, the freshest way to get them is to procure them yourself, right? So if you're growing them in your garden and know when to harvest them, then you are going to get the absolute freshest herbs that you could even dream of. So, what would you have to say about that? Like, what is the best method in your mind for leaning into this sort of herbal medicine, building your own apothecary, and becoming your own shaman?
Well, I think that we need to take it one step at a time and realize that no matter where you are, where you live, you can grow a pot of something. Even if it's you live in an apartment, you can use some pots on your balcony, or you can use a couple of pots in your kitchen sink, in your kitchen window. There's always a way. Now, here's another thing that I think has really taken a huge rise, especially lately, are communities, community gardens. Like I live on a street I live in a city. I live in Salt Lake City. I don't live out in the rural part. I live in the city, and I live on a street, and it's been cultivated over the years that I've lived here, which has been a long time. The community where there are 3 or 4 people that have different fruit trees, they grow different things in their herb garden. I have a neighbor that has like 40 chickens, the person who lives right next to me. And there's people who have a couple of goats, a few houses down. So I live on a pretty unique street that's in the middle of a city, but we share. So there's things that I grow in my garden that I know about and I share with other people in just even on my own street. So I think that if we realize we can grow fresh things, no matter where we live or what our situation is, there's that first. And then we need to get to know our neighbors. We need to build a community because then we share. We share, I have a peach tree, an apple tree, and an apricot tree. And I have neighbors. I have a neighbor who has a walnut tree, plum trees, and I don't want to have all those other trees, but we share, and and we have so much. There's actually a nonprofit here in Salt Lake that will come to your house and they'll pick all your extra fruit. You still pay a fee, which is great. I'm so happy to be able to pay them so it doesn't go to waste. And they donate it to the food bank and they get to take part of what they pick. And, so I think it's easier than we think to be able to grow your own fresh stuff so that you get all the benefits.
I mentioned in my opening not for profit called fallingfruit.org. Ethan Welty is the founder of that company, and they do an interesting thing where you can go and log the fruiting trees or things along those lines that are in your neighborhood on public lands so people can harvest them. And one of the things that I absolutely love, which you'll never find on a grocery store shelf, is the strawberry tree, right? And they're these little prickly little fruits that are kind of golden underneath, but with redness on the outside. They're very high in vitamin C. They're delicious and they just don't keep well. Like you pick them at ripe peakness and you eat them right then, and they're just divine. Now, there are so many of them in my neighborhood. So I went ahead and logged them. Some are at the industrial park that has my medical offices as well, right? Because they're commonly planted as ornamentals. And then in our own yard, we grow a lot of plums, but frankly, the squirrels and birds end up getting more of them than we do these days. And then we also have lemon trees. And I have a funny story about this. My lemon tree, my kids had basically picked all the lemons when they were green and thrown them on the ground for fun, I guess. And so I had made this recipe in my kitchen, which was like a lentil stew with a lot of Indian spices, and it called for lemon, and I now didn't have any. So I walked down the street to my neighbor's tree, who I didn't think was home at the time. I knew he wouldn't mind. I grabbed a lemon, and then he comes out the door. He's like, "Did you just steal a lemon from my tree?" And I just said, "Hi, Leland.
Sorry.
Yes, I did." And then he's just like,
You caught me
"You
red-handed.
caught me." And so a little later that evening, I came back to his house and knocked on the door, and I gave him some of the soup that I made with half a lemon that I had
I
stolen from his
love
tree.
that.
So, there's comical ways that you can also engage in this, but, if I thought he was home, I would have knocked on his door. It is what it is. But,
I think borrowing a lemon is better than borrowing a cup of sugar,
well,
right?
no kidding, right? And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
these are things that are naturally growing. I mean, generally speaking here, we don't really have to water them extra once their roots are established. You'll get more fruit if you do, but you don't necessarily need to. You can do kind of dry farming. And the plums are just going off. So I've got pluots and red, what is it? A Roseville plum, something like it's named after a city. I always forget. It starts with an R. Anyway, so because they're not self fruitful, so we have to have two. And, unfortunately, this year I was gone for part of the fruiting, and so what happened is one of the branches got so heavy that it broke. And so this beautiful branch of green plums is now like, bending to the ground. But there's benefit in collaborating with community for that exact reason too, because sometimes it's a little bit of work to maintain a fruit tree. And if I had thought ahead a little bit, I might have asked a neighbor to check in on them for me. So I think this is one of the stories that gets us engaged with local community because, again, food is something that can be collaborative. And so if you are, in a space where you can plant and your neighbors can plant, then you can do a little bit of cross collaboration. Like, hey, I'm going to grow string beans. Hey, you're growing tomatoes. You want to do some trade this year? And they'll be open to it. You're going to save bank for one, because these are now rising in cost. And secondarily, it's going to be super fresh, picked at peakness of ripeness, and will be delicious. So I really encourage that if people can manage to engage a little bit more in community. And if you have a surplus, to engage with a fallingfruit.org, logging it, and or working with the local community that will come and harvest your trees. That's amazing.
Yeah, I love that. In fact, I think even in a city, my brother-in-law and his wife live in Manhattan, and there's a community garden. There's tons of community gardens all over the city, and they're not really interested in. Well, they live in an apartment, but they don't have the space, and so they actually participate in this community garden. So even anywhere in a city, I think one of the most important things that we can learn is how to feed ourselves, because you get there's a lot of empowerment in that, but then there's so much more dense nutrition, and we're all realizing that this is an important piece of being a human being, is getting the most bang for our buck out of. And the thing is, most food, I mean, when I grow a couple tomato plants or I grow squash, my husband is a cook in our family, and he takes the squash blossoms and ends up making the whole summer these beautiful dishes out of squash blossoms, because we get so much squash off of one plant. You know how squash grows, and if you see one underneath a leaf and it's like this big, and you're like, I'm never going to eat this because it's now too tough, and no one will take it if I give it to them. So food is so really abundant, especially food that you grow in your garden.
Yes.
Really.
I mean, I've had the zucchini that was, as big as a thigh, and I tried to salvage it by baking it, and it just wasn't
Oh,
very good, like no flavor.
yeah, you
So,
have to get them when they're little.
yeah, you really do. And I mean, it still looks fantastic, but it becomes ornamental at that point, I think.
It does. It's like, look what came out of my garden. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, like the pumpkins that are 1,000 pounds and win, the award for the largest pumpkin at the local, what is it? Harvest fair, something like that.
Right, right, right. But you can't really eat them when they're
No,
that big.
they're just not good. It's the little pumpkins that make good pumpkin pie.
True, true,
Yeah.
true.
And so I wonder, as we talk about natural health and wellness, if there are a couple of herbs that you wanted to highlight from your book that people might be able to engage with in a new way that they may not have heard of before, since we've talked about some of the familiar. Let's get into the unfamiliar.
Yeah, yeah. So I have a couple of mushrooms in there. So different than herbs, but mushrooms have also made a huge surge recently.
Yeah, I
Um,
saw lion's mane in the beginning chapter.
exactly. Yeah. So lion's mane, it's actually a culinary mushroom. So you can take, sometimes you can forage for lion's mane, even though actually there's a grocery store here in Salt Lake City that's a little bit of a higher end. They have a little more things that aren't common in grocery stores, but you can actually get foraged lion's mane mushrooms and you can cook with them.
Yeah,
Same,
which health food store is that?
it's actually a local Utah grocery store called Harmon's.
Oh, yeah, I know Harmon's. Yeah,
Yeah.
good.
And there's a couple of them that sometimes they'll have lion's mane mushrooms. So, lion's mane is good for your brain. It actually stimulates nerve growth factor, and it's been very, very well studied. And I just thought it would be really cool to put in something that is, really important for cognitive health and for people to realize, oh, I can actually cook with this. I
Mhm.
can, you know, my husband actually loves cooking with it. Also, there's a plant that is not very well known, but this was a plant my dad studied for 30 years. And I feel like this is kind of a plant that I teach about, I talk about all the time. It's a plant called lomatium,
Mm.
and my dad didn't have it in his original book, but and we've had people ask us over the years, why didn't your dad include this? This is one of the things that he was known for.
Mhm.
So this is a Native American plant. There's about 10 species of it. So it's not, even though it's not very well known, it only is wild crafted. So you can't cultivate it. So that's kind of what makes it a little bit less known. But the species we use is called Lomatium dissectum, and then the variation is called multifida, which only means something if you're trying to go out and wildcraft it or harvest it. And you should do it not only sustainably, but go into places where either if you have permission on private property, we actually own 40 acres where it grows at this point, but if it's on public lands, make sure you step through the proper hoops to get a permit to actually wildcraft. Because it's great to forage, it's great to go out and learn how to identify plants, but make sure you're doing it not only sustainably, but with the proper permits and
Well, I think
permission.
this is in particular very important when we talk about mushrooms too, because
Yes, very
people in my
important.
local community or in the Pacific Northwest, I'm in Santa Cruz County, there's some redwood forest here, but people will over harvest them. And if you're leaving behind only about 10% of what you see, and then somebody else comes through and takes the rest of it, then there's not much for it to recover from. And in the Pacific Northwest, because the morel mushroom has become so popular, that one has been subject to a lot of over harvesting as well. So I just think we need to be mindful and to educate other people in our community around that front as well, because sometimes people just don't know. They're out there and they're like, oh, look what I came across. And they don't understand that it could mean that they don't come back next year.
Yeah, well, it could, I mean, it's all so important. This to me is a really important piece of the whole puzzle, not just for survivability of a species, but also for survivability of our species. Because if you misidentify a plant or a mushroom, they figure there's about 3 million mushrooms and they've identified about 13,000 of them. And only about 12 or 13 are like medicinal mushrooms, and part of those include edible mushrooms like shiitake and maitake. You know, I love turkey tail and chaga, and but the thing is, if you misidentify because there's so many species, you could not only wipe out the species if you over harvest, you consume them, you could hurt yourself, or you could possibly not be alive.
Yeah,
So
that's pretty
I
dramatic, right?
think,
In
yeah,
my
it
local
can
community,
be
it's
dramatic.
chanterelles grow a lot here.
Yeah.
Things like that. It's a golden chanterelle, and they're also best picked before they get completely blown out. So, you have to know when, and you have to know what they look like and be sure you've identified the thing that you think you have. And some of them are good at mimicking one another. So it's like there's a reason that you can refer to people who really know mushrooms as mycologists. In fact, I had founder of Om Mushrooms on this podcast a little bit ago, And so she had shared that you pretty much need to cook all mushrooms. And I didn't know that that was a worry. And I typically eat my lion's mane raw when I get it. What do you tend to advise people to do? I'm just curious about what your perspective is.
I think there's not a right or wrong way with, because I like raw mushrooms, depends on what they are too. But I'm
Mhm.
also I'm I'm very tuned in to not just my own intuition about what I eat, but I feel like I'm really tuned into the actual plant or the mushroom.
Mhm.
Like I think we have an energetic connection with plants that's kind of been stomped out of us a little bit. It sounds like you have this as well, where you intuitively eat. I think we need to educate ourselves. I prefer my lion's mane actually cooked, only because of the taste or the texture. It's actually really good. It depends. It's almost like anything that you cook, and if you saute it with different things, and one of my favorite ways is just to saute it with a little bit of garlic and olive oil, and then salt and pepper. It's super yummy, and you just saute it, not till it's all totally. You can make it crispy, but yeah, and I like raw lion's mane as well. So I don't think there's a right or wrong way. I think some of it can be individual. So yeah, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do mushrooms like that.
Yeah. Now, I wondered, given that you also have this company, Barlow Herbal, that you resurrected after your father had passed. And so now this company is living on in its second life under your tutelage. I wondered if you could share a little bit about what your medicine cabinet looks like as somebody who has been so deeply steeped in herbs throughout her life.
Oh my goodness. It is actually quite extensive at this point, partly because so my dad passed away 26 years ago. I restarted his company 4 years after he passed. And he had a line of what mostly tinctures. He did do a couple of capsule things and some injectables, but he did mostly tinctures. He developed this kind of a cold, there's no heat, there's no pressure. It's actually a pretty simple extraction technique to make a tincture. A tincture is technically, and I'm sure you probably know this, it's an alcohol based extraction where, some of these, especially root herbs need to, because the constituents they're so much more viable when they're extracting alcohol. So if you were to take a look at this point, my apothecary, I have a detached building behind my house, and it's not, we don't park any cars in it. We don't, it's my building. In fact, when we were building the house 15 years ago, like 2,500 square feet, there's an office. That's where I'm sitting right now, is upstairs. There's my office. So downstairs, right below where I'm sitting, I have probably, my goodness, I have a couple of hundred things. I mostly herbs tincturing, and then blends of things. So if a family member says to me, "Hey, I'm feeling this way. Can you blend up something for me?" Or my liver needs a little bit more support. So I really have taken this to a pretty high level, and this is how I also formulate. So if I'm going to work on a new blend, like a couple years ago, I brought out a tincture for kidneys. And so what I do is I'll get the raw herbs, and I have different sourcing. I don't wildcraft most of the herbs. I actually have different sourcing. And then I'll tincture them mostly individually. And then I'll start working with what's the percentage I need of this plant and this plant. And I have this whole process where I formulate. So that actually adds to what I have in my own personal apothecary. It's actually pretty fun at this point because I'm so familiar with what they do and what I have. And so one of my siblings might call me up and say, "Hey, can I just get a tincture of lemon balm?" And so I have it. I just pump them out a bottle and put a dropper on it and throw a handmade label on it and
Here you
send it
go.
off to them. Yeah. So it's just reached a super fun point where, to me, it does feel like I have the ability to be a shaman, but in the whitest of worlds. As far as, like, I am a white shaman, and I will own that. But yes.
Well, I appreciate the candor. Now, I also think it's helpful for people to understand what you do differently than some of the other brands that they might be familiar with. So let's just talk about the spectrum of them. Again, you might have something like the flower essence remedies of Bach Homeopathics or Boiron, who makes homeopathics, which just a very minuscule amount of an echo of the actives in it. Then you have brands like Herb Farm that are in most health food stores, and then everything in between, right? And Herb Farm has a lot of single herb tinctures, like that's their master house. You go in, you're like, got okay, be your own, I guess, apothecary in this way, but not a ton of blends. Then what you're doing differently with Barlow, given your family history and how you see what you do as standing out in some way.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I first of all, there's a very high intention behind what we do. It's not we just want to be on every health food store shelf. In fact, you won't find us there. When my dad was alive, he sold only to practitioners. Like there were naturopaths and acupuncturists and chiropractors. So it was mostly natural medicine, functional medicine doctors. And when I restarted his company after he passed, that was really where I started too, because a lot of these doctors kind of were like, hey, we need these in our practice. And then as time has gone on, and my dad really was alive right at the end, right at the beginning of where the internet started. So he wasn't able to kind of have the reach, even though he used to do a ton of talk radio, especially when he was promoting his book. And he would get on these big 50-watt radio stations, and he would there would be like a 1 hour show, totally audible, only radio. People would call in with
Yeah, the fact that
questions.
you and I both know what a 50-watt radio station is like that's like WR radio in New York City. It's like one of the big ones,
Exactly.
right? They get like
Exactly.
enough span that you can hear it in Philadelphia from New York City. So, like, just so people can get a perspective on what that means. It's covering a large region, typically quite populous because you don't just have a 50-watt station in a smaller community. It'd be Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, New York, maybe Miami, I don't know, like, just kind of give people that frame of reference.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and that was a long time ago. So, yeah, so he it would have a big reach, but what would happen is as he started talking and answering questions, not just from the host of the radio show, but people would call in. They were so hungry for knowledge even 45, 50 years ago that the show would go on for 2 or 3 hours. It was supposed to only be an hour because people couldn't get it. So my intention for restarting my dad's company, first of all, I was in corporate America and I wasn't happy. That was my number. My kids had just gotten out of high, both my boys were graduated from high school. So I'm like, I can afford to step out of corporate America and I don't need to make a ton of money. I just want to be happy. And I knew that my dad's legacy needed to be carried on. And then, really, what happened, and I'm just going to kind of go this into a nutshell because I could talk about this for a long time, is about 5 years in, I formulated one of my own first formulas. And I did a ton of research on, this plant lomatium that I talked about. It, for some people, when they use it for the first time, there's a potential for a one-time full body detox rash. And
Ooh,
as I
that's
was
more extreme than something like, niacin flesh. That's
Oh,
yeah.
yes. Yes, yes, yes. I've seen at this point thousands of this rash. It's not a dangerous rash. It is very intense for some people. It only happens once. It's very classic. And again, this is something I could talk about. But what happened is during those first few years, as I started going and talking to people, they're off the ledge from this rash, I started kind of collaborating with other doctors that had been friends of my dad's. And what we found is if you support and detox the liver, it prevents the rash in most people. So prior to taking the plant, let's get your liver healthy so that your liver, your skin is your largest organ. Let's make your liver healthy so it can take the majority of any type of detoxing that you need to do. So I started thinking I need to formulate something as a precursor to trying lomatium by itself.
So I'm
So I
imagining that that would include something like milk thistle, maybe artichoke, something along those lines?
Yes, so dandelion. I actually didn't use milk thistle in this one. I used dandelion root, which is very similar for the liver as milk thistle. I also used red root. I used vervain. I used a little bit of sarsaparilla. But let me tell you, this is where I think this is really unique. And it took me a long time to talk about it. But when I first sat down with all my research, because I'm not a botanist like my dad, I'm all experience and all this is just what I grew up with. So I'm kind of feeling a little bit unworthy. Like, how did I okay, I'm not my dad. I'm. but I can research and I can read and I can do a lot of due diligence and I can collaborate with other people. So I did that.
So you
And
suffered from imposter syndrome before we called it that.
yes, 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 1,000%. And it took me little while to get out of that. And I'm fully out of that now. But, 20 years ago, it was like, okay, so I sat down with all of my research and I'm a big meditator. And I'm a person who believes in connecting with our higher self because we are full of wisdom that we don't tap into very often. And I sat down in a quiet space with all of my research. And I thought, okay, I need to formulate something that people can take prior to taking this plant lamatium that will help their body be supported and detoxed without and can prevent the rash. And then I just sat with all my notes. And what started dropping in, I just turned the page to a blank page and I just started writing. And within 10 minutes, I had this most beautiful formula. And this has been out now for 15 or 16 years, this blend. And at first I was like, I kind of sat my pen down and I was like, oh, okay. Oh, and I was covered in chills. I was just like, and I've since had
I mean,
actually a
I'm
couple.
covered in chills now.
Yeah.
I'm just hearing about it.
Well, and I actually didn't tell anybody about this for a few years because I was like that imposter syndrome thing. I'm like, okay. And then people started taking it and it did exactly what it was designed to do. And there was still now a little bit, some people would still get the rash, but it took it down from about 10% down to about 3% of people who would get this rash. So it turned out to be very effective. And it's still one of the most popular things we make. And
Okay,
so
now, Jane, I'm gonna have to ask you to send me some.
okay, I would love to, of course.
Yes, and then
No,
I can
this
come
is
back and share my experience with the audience too, but I'd love to experience that and also the detoxifying power of this amazing herb because, I've recently mostly given up drinking alcohol too, and I feel like now would be the time to really cleanse my body of all of that damage, right?
oh no, that's so perfect. In fact, I love that. Well, so let me just finish this very last piece. So basically, because of this whole interest in psychedelics and sacred plants, about 3 years ago, I had my first facilitated plant medicine journey. And in this journey, my dad came in. He came in and he basically said to me, I've been helping you, I've been inspiring you. And I was like, okay, confirmation. And so that was like, and now I haven't second guessed it for a long time, but I've now brought out some formulas that are like, okay, I do all my due diligence, I do all my research. It's not like I'm just going to go sit somewhere and go, okay, I'm ready for the downloads. Give me the inspiration, Dad. I never do that. But what happens is when I sit with my research and I go into my flow space, I don't care how long it takes me. I just, and then literally it feels like my pen has a life of its own. And this formula drops in. Like I have this beautiful lung blend that's been out for about 10 years. And some of the things that I've watched people transform their lung health with has just made me so humble. So that's my formulation method is unique. And like I said, I was a little bit embarrassed to share for the first time, and now I'm not.
Well, I
This
just
is
think it's
this
a
is
beautiful story. It
Yeah,
really is.
yeah. But the
Mm,
alcohol thing, can I touch on that super
yes,
quick?
please. Mhm.
Okay, so I said my husband is a cook. He's a chef. He's like beyond talented. And for all the years we've been married, 25 years, he pairs nice food with a nice glass of wine. And on a Wednesday night, it's like he makes this beautiful meal and here's the perfect glass of wine to go with it. And for a lot of years, I would take breaks like, okay, I'm going to not drink for 100 days because it just doesn't resonate with what I'm trying to accomplish in the world. I need full on 1,000% clarity. And alcohol is a neurotoxin. We all know that.
It
So
damages the gut microbiota. There's a lot of
right?
reasons, right?
Oh my gosh. And alcohol is so, we're taught it's good for us. It's good for longevity. Drink red wine because of resveratrol and all the things that are come at us that is really, we know is not true.
Yeah, not founded in science, not
No,
proven,
no,
right?
no, no. It's all founded in good marketing and all of that, which, I don't judge anyone if they want. I drank for a long time. Last November, right before Thanksgiving, I just had said to myself, you keep saying you want to stop drinking alcohol. And so I just said, I'm done. And so I swapped it out for tea. So I haven't had any alcohol since last November, and it's been easy. And I feel amazing. Like the clarity and my sleep is, and I've always slept good, and I feel like I'm on the top of my game, but I'm in my 60s and I feel amazing.
Yeah, I know. You look amazing too. So I personally have been on that trend myself. And, I've been limiting my alcohol, but going mostly plant based and just reading so much research and kind of working to dispel my prior knowledge because I was under the impression that in order to maintain healthy muscle mass, I really needed to be eating animal meats or animal proteins. And I have completely disproven that at this point. I've been off of them since late January and I put on a pound of muscle and I'm like stronger now than I was then. I do assisted pull-ups because I've been forever on this goal of I want to do a pull-up like without any assisted weight. So I went from having 70 pounds assisted weight to 50 in the course of a month.
Ooh.
So that means that I'm lifting 20 pounds more just like that. Well, maintaining the same weight. So it's not like I dropped 20 pounds. I mean, that would also be amazing because I'm, battling some of that potentially is perimenopause. Like I'm almost 48. I don't have other symptoms, but I'm finding it a little harder to get rid of belly fat and stuff like that. So transitioning to being fully plant-based and doing that and being able to maintain that energy, sleeping better. The things I've also noticed is I had to adjust my thyroid medication. I was overstimulated. And so I know my body well enough to be able to make that shift, but I haven't been able to get completely off of my thyroid medication since I was diagnosed as hypothyroid back in, well, I was 29 at the time. So this is almost 20 years ago. So I'm now acknowledging that perhaps because I'm to 2/3 of the medication I was at just 4 months ago, that this style of eating and not consuming alcohol, I may be able to get off of this thing and I'll be prescription drug free forever, which
Well, I can give you some tips too off camera. I can give you
I
some
would
tips
love to hear them. But this is just about personal journeys here. Like, I mean,
for
we're
sure.
not recommending diagnosing or any of
No,
this
no,
stuff,
no,
but
no,
it's
no,
like
no, no.
this is a sort of when you really start listening to your body and when you really start acknowledging how you feel when you eat something. And I think one of the ways to really acknowledge that is to journal. Like, you don't need to necessarily be channeling from the ether, though sometimes we get there too and we gain this new knowledge, right? But journaling about how you feel on a daily basis and actually documenting the foods you ate. And then how did you feel an hour after? And how did you feel before? And how hungry were you? How quickly? Like these sorts of things, just asking yourself some basic questions can help you to learn to listen to the signals that your body's giving you and not just eat mindlessly or I don't know if it's mindlessly. It's just like eat by habit, kind of like, oh, it's this time and these are the things I eat, and then not really think about it twice, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you're spot on.
Wow. Well, I have so enjoyed this conversation and I would love to invite you back. I would also love to experiment personally with some of your products and enjoy them and really see where we can take this conversation from there. But at this point in the conversation of every episode I host, I like to ask my guests if there was a question that they wish I'd asked that perhaps I hadn't, or if there was a closing thought that you'd like to leave our audience with. The floor is yours.
No, I don't think you left any questions out, but I would say that anyone who's listening, if they've been struggling with any type of health issue, because I think there's so much chronic pain and chronic health issues, that we need to realize we are designed so perfectly. Our human bodies know how to heal. I mean, if you think about the food that we eat, the processed food, the junk food, all the stuff that we maybe have gone through phases, and our body still lives and not just survives, but a lot of times we can thrive even off of bad foods. So imagine when you start giving your body the right tools, we thrive and we burst into this beautiful blossom of health. And we need to remember that our health is not complicated. We are not complicated. We've complicated it, but health is simple. Health is super simple. Do the simple things. Eat the simple foods. Leave the complicated part out. Tune back into yourself. Meditate, journal, in my journaling, and I would suggest you do this too, not just write down what you're eating and how you feel, because that is really powerful, but sit for a minute and ask your higher self, what do you want to tell me today? And then be still. And you don't have to be, you just let yourself dip into the wisdom that you have inside yourself. And I think that the world would look so different if each of us, one at a time, start bringing ourselves into vibrant, beautiful health. It's very simple.
I love that, Jane. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
To find out more about Jane Barlow Christensen, visit the links that we provide in show notes. You'll find a link to our expanded blog page on caremorebebetter.com, which includes the video version of this podcast episode, complete transcripts, and links to the additional resources and episodes that we discussed today. And as a reminder, we are prepping to launch our new Cause Before Commerce site this summer, circleb.co. This site will host the same great content that you find here today on caremorebebetter.com, while also providing helpful tools to help you live a little greener and a little more socially and locally engaged. You'll find how-to guides and DIY tools that can help you renew what you have, replace the things that you buy, and reduce waste. CircleB.co will offer plastic-free products from housewares and clothing to supplements and personal care items, perhaps even Barlow Herbal, all of which are circular in design, that minimize waste and that seek to eliminate or limit the use of plastics. You can explore our landing page now to learn more about this upcoming launch. Just visit circleb.co. Thank you, listeners and watchers, now and always, for being a part of this pod and this community, because together we really can do so much more. We can even build a healthier society that prizes your individual health and perhaps become our own shamans along the way. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.